The town of Willow Creek was little more than a scattering of wooden storefronts, a church with a leaning steeple, and a row of homesteads that stretched out into the wind-swept prairie. Life there was rough, built on calloused hands and unyielding land, but it was also a place where reputations were made quickly, and once formed, they stuck like burrs to a saddle blanket. None knew that truth more than the Dawson sisters. Clara Dawson was the eldest, and she had been born with every gift a frontier girl could hope for. Delicate features, golden hair that caught the sun like wheat, and a smile that made young men tip their hats and shuffle their boots in awkward admiration. From the time she was 15, cowboys lined up at barn dances just for the chance to twirl her across the floor. Mothers whispered that Clara would marry rich, perhaps a rancher who could give her a fine house with lace curtains, far from the dust of Willow Creek. She basked in the attention, and it seemed to everyone she was destined for something more. Eliza, 2 years younger, was cut from different cloth. Her hair was a darker shade, always pulled back in a practical braid, and her hands bore the rough signs of work, scrubbing floors, tending to the family's modest garden, patching her sister's gowns so Clara always looked her best. Where Clara's laughter rang out like a bell, Eliza's words were quiet, thoughtful, rarely drawing notice. Folks often overlooked her entirely except to compare the two. "Pretty as Clara is, poor Eliza favors her pa," the neighbors would say with a shrug, meaning plain and forgettable. The sisters lived with their widowed mother on a weathered homestead just outside town. Their father had been taken by fever years ago, leaving the girls to shoulder more than their share of responsibility. Yet even in that, their roles were divided. Clara tended to the social side, ensuring they were never excluded from church suppers or town picnics, while Eliza bore the weight of the chores, from milking the cow at dawn to stoking the fire late at night. For Eliza, the balance seemed unfair, though she never spoke of it. When she walked through town with Clara, she could feel the difference in how people's eyes rested on them. Men would nod politely at her, but linger on Clara with smiles that said more than words. Even Pastor Green, a kindly man, seemed to forget her name sometimes, though he never failed to greet Clara with warmth. It wasn't jealousy so much as the quiet ache of invisibility that Eliza carried in her chest, a longing to be seen for who she was rather than simply Clara's sister. Still, she found solace in her duties. Eliza loved the feel of soil between her fingers as she planted beans in neat rows, the rhythm of scrubbing laundry beside the creek, the simple satisfaction of baking bread that rose golden in the oven. These small acts, unnoticed by most, grounded her in a way her sister's charms never could. Where Clara sought admiration, Eliza found strength and usefulness. It was a fragile balance that defined their lives in Willow Creek, one sister shining brightly, drawing every eye, the other cast in shadow, steady but unseen. No one questioned it, for that was simply the way things were. Every cowboy in town wanted Clara, and Eliza, though she never said it aloud, had quietly resigned herself to being left behind. What neither sister could have guessed, however, was that everything was about to change. The winds of fate often blew hardest through quiet lives, and soon enough, a man would ride into Willow Creek who would see things differently. The rhythm of Willow Creek life was marked by small rituals. Sunday services, barn dances, quilting circles, and Saturday visits to the general store. In each of these settings, Clara Dawson reigned like a queen. Men from near and far seemed to find reasons to linger wherever she was, their hats in hand and eyes shining with the kind of hope only a young man in springtime could wear. At the church socials, Clara never lacked for partners. Cowboys from sprawling cattle spreads rode miles just for a chance to escort her across the wooden floor. She wore her prettiest calico dress, the hem fluttering around her ankles as she laughed and twirled. When she laughed, the whole room seemed to lean toward her as if catching light. The sheriff himself, a man known for his stern ways, softened whenever Clara looked his direction. A smile from her was enough to make hardened ranch hands forget their troubles. Eliza was always nearby, but she might as well have been invisible. She poured coffee, fetched biscuits, and helped Mrs. Patterson with the pies, content to keep busy rather than sit idle while the other girls danced. When men glanced her way, it was usually in polite acknowledgement, as though she were part of the furniture. Some were kind enough to tip their hats, but most looked straight past her, their eyes fixed on Clara's golden hair and bright smile. At home, the differences between them were even clearer. Clara spent her afternoons preparing for visits, curling her hair or sewing ribbons onto her dresses. Eliza spent hers bent over the washtub, scrubbing mud from their skirts so Clara could always appear spotless at town gatherings. When evening came, Clara would step out the door like a star about to take the stage, while Eliza stayed behind to mind the stew simmering on the hearth and check on their ailing mother's needs. It wasn't that Eliza begrudged her sister the admiration. Clara had always been this way, even as a child, radiant, noticed, adored. But sometimes, when she watched Clara return home flushed with the excitement of compliments and courtship, Eliza felt a heaviness in her chest. It was the weight of knowing she would never be chosen first or perhaps chosen at all. She was the girl with strong arms from lifting water buckets, with skirts that always carried the faint smell of soap. Practical, dependable. Not the sort of woman who turned heads. The suitors came in droves. There was Henry Wilkins, who owned a fine spread of cattle and brought Clara bouquets of wildflowers every week. There was Matthew Jones, a young store clerk who saved his wages for a silver locket he intended to give her. And then there were the nameless cowboys who appeared at dances, men hardened by trail life but softened by Clara's charm. Each of them hoped to win her hand, and none paid mind to the quieter sister who kept their coffee cups filled. The townsfolk noticed, too. Mothers whispered about which lucky man Clara would choose, while shaking their heads at Eliza's future. "She's a good girl," they would murmur, "but plain as day. She'll be needed at home to look after her mama." In their eyes, Eliza's path was already set, not toward love or marriage, but toward duty and sacrifice. Yet in the stillness of night, when the lamps were blown out and the sisters lay in their shared room, Eliza sometimes let herself dream. She imagined a man who might see her, truly see her, not as Clara's sister, not as the girl left behind, but as Eliza herself. It was a fragile hope, one she barely dared to name, but it flickered quietly in her heart, and though she didn't know it yet, that fragile hope was about to be tested. For the winds of change were already stirring on the horizon, carrying with them the sound of hoofbeats, the arrival of someone who would turn the patterns of Willow Creek upside down. The morning Daniel Hayes rode into Willow Creek, the town stirred with the kind of curiosity that only a stranger could provoke. Dust rose behind his horse as he approached, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying him down the main street where children paused their play, women peeked from behind lace curtains, and men straightened from their work to study the newcomer. He was not like the eager young cowboys who often passed through. Daniel bore the marks of long years on the trail. A scar cut across his cheekbone, his broad shoulders spoke of hard labor, and his eyes, steel gray and watchful, seemed to measure everything he saw. His hat was pulled low against the sun, his coat worn but cared for. He sat his horse with the kind of quiet authority that came from both skill and survival. Clara Dawson, of course, was the first to notice. She had been standing outside the general store with a cluster of friends, their chatter loud and full of girlish laughter. When Daniel dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, Clara's eyes lit up as if she'd just spotted a golden coin in the dirt. Here was a man unlike the others, seasoned, commanding, with a mystery that begged to be unraveled. "Who do you suppose he is?" Clara whispered to her friend Sarah, smoothing the front of her dress as though the stranger's eyes might already be upon her. Sarah giggled. "Whoever he is, he doesn't look like the type to linger long," but Clara ignored her, stepping forward with practiced ease, pretending to browse the bolts of cloth displayed outside the store so she could position herself in his path. When Daniel emerged carrying a small parcel, she offered a dazzling smile. "New to town?" she asked lightly, tilting her head in a way that made her curls catch the sunlight. Daniel paused, his gaze resting on her for a moment. He tipped his hat politely. "Just passing through. Name's Hayes. Daniel Hayes. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who did not waste words. Clara's friends tittered behind her, nudging one another. Every cowboy in Willow Creek had tried for Clara's attention, and here she was, quick as lightning, laying her claim on the stranger. It was exactly what everyone expected, but Daniel didn't linger. He nodded politely, excused himself, and stepped away. His eyes, sharp and observant, had already taken in more than Clara's beauty. He noticed the way Eliza, standing near the trough with a pail of water, paused to watch the exchange, her expression unreadable. Eliza had not meant to stare. She had been fetching water for the household when the stranger arrived, but something about him drew her gaze. Perhaps it was the scar on his face, proof of hardships endured, or the quiet way he carried himself, so unlike the boastful cowboys who usually swaggered into town. Whatever it was, she found herself studying him longer than she should have. And then, unexpectedly, Daniel's eyes met hers. For a brief second, she felt pinned in place, as though he had looked straight through the quiet shell she carried and glimpsed something deeper. Her breath caught, and she quickly dropped her gaze, embarrassed. She was used to being overlooked. Being noticed felt dangerous, almost unbearable. Daniel, however, carried that brief image of her as he mounted his horse and rode toward the livery stable. Clara might have shone brightly, commanding attention, but it was the quiet girl by the trough whose eyes lingered in his mind. The people of Willow Creek talked for days about the new cowboy. Some said he was a rancher from Texas, others claimed he'd worked cattle drives up north. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the mystery he carried, and the question of who would win his attention. Clara, for her part, had already decided the answer. Eliza, meanwhile, told herself it was foolish to even wonder. Men like Daniel Hayes did not see girls like her, or so she thought. The barn dance that Saturday night was the sort of gathering that lit up the whole town of Willow Creek. Lanterns swung from rafters, spilling warm golden light across the wide planked floor, while a fiddler and banjo player struck up tunes that made boots tap and skirts swirl. The scent of cornbread and roasted pork wafted from the long tables. Laughter and chatter rose above the music, and young cowboys competed for the honor of leading the prettiest girls out to dance. Naturally, Clara Dawson was the center of it all. She wore her blue calico dress, the one with tiny white flowers, that Eliza had painstakingly mended the week before. Clara's hair shone in loose curls, her smile dazzling as she floated from one admirer to the next. Cowboys nearly came to blows over who would claim her for the first dance. By the time the fiddler struck the second tune, Clara was already spinning gracefully in Daniel Hayes's arms. Eliza stood near the refreshment table, quietly refilling cups of lemonade. From her vantage point, she could see the crowd parting around her sister, the admiring gazes that followed Clara wherever she went. Eliza tried to tell herself she didn't care. It was the same story every dance, after all. But she couldn't quite stop her eyes from drifting toward Daniel. He was a strong dancer, though his movements were restrained, not flashy. Unlike the other men who puffed up with pride at having Clara in their arms, Daniel seemed almost detached, as though his thoughts wandered elsewhere even as Clara laughed and leaned closer. Clara was trying her best. Eliza could tell by the tilt of her sister's head and the exaggerated sparkle in her eyes. She wanted Daniel's full attention, but if Daniel was impressed, he hid it well. Later, when the music paused and Clara went off to chatter with her friends, Daniel stepped outside for air. Eliza, carrying an empty pitcher to refill at the water trough, found herself crossing the yard at the same moment. She froze when she realized he was there, leaning against the rail, hat tipped back as he studied the night sky. Daniel noticed her immediately. "Evenin'," he said, his voice carrying that same steady calm she remembered from their first meeting. Eliza's heart jolted. Most men didn't bother greeting her if Clara was nearby. She clutched the pitcher tighter and managed a small nod. "Evenin'." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The sounds of laughter and fiddles spilled faintly from the barn, but here beneath the stars, the world felt still. Daniel tilted his head, watching her. You weren't dancing? Eliza let out a short, awkward laugh. Nobody's much interested in asking when Clara's in the room. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and immediately her cheeks burned. She ducked her head, mortified. But Daniel didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes softened. Seems to me they're missing out. Eliza looked up sharply, startled. His tone wasn't playful or mocking, it was genuine. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, not in all her years of standing in Clara's shadow. Before she could reply, Clara's voice rang out from the barn door. "There you are, Mr. Hayes." She came sweeping toward them, skirts rustling, eyes alight with possessive triumph. Sliding her hand into Daniel's arm, she smiled brightly. "You promised me another dance." Daniel glanced at Eliza one last time, as though reluctant to break the moment. Then, with a courteous nod, he allowed Clara to lead him back inside. Eliza stood alone by the trough, her hands trembling around the heavy pitcher. The music rose again, filling the night. But all she could hear was the echo of his words. "Seems to me they're missing out." For the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps she wasn't as invisible as she had always believed. By the following week, Willow Creek was buzzing like a hive. News of Daniel Hayes, the rugged stranger with the scar and the steady eyes, had spread through every corner of town, and with it came a new wave of gossip. People speculated about where he came from, what he wanted, and most of all, who he would choose for company. The smart money, of course, was on Clara Dawson. It seemed obvious to nearly everyone. Clara had a way of drawing men like moths to a flame, and Daniel, though reserved, had already danced with her more than once at the barn gathering. The girls in town whispered that Clara had surely caught him already. The older women nodded knowingly. "That Dawson girl'll marry rich? Mark my words." The young cowboys sighed in defeat, recognizing a rival too formidable to challenge. But beneath the surface, not everyone was so certain. A few sharp-eyed observers had noticed how Daniel sometimes glanced toward Eliza instead of Clara, how his words with the younger Dawson sister carried a weight and gentleness absent when he spoke to others. Still, these observations were quickly dismissed. After all, who would choose Eliza when Clara stood shining beside her? Clara herself, however, was not so quick to dismiss the possibility. She prided herself on reading men, and something about Daniel unsettled her. He was polite, certainly, and no one could say he was cold, but he did not fall under her spell the way others always had. Clara was used to men tripping over their words, puffing up their chests, trying to outdo one another for her amusement. Daniel did none of that. He watched her with a kind of measured patience, as though weighing her worth rather than assuming it. That small gap between the attention she expected and the attention she received gnawed at Clara's pride. It made her more determined than ever. At home, Clara grew restless, speaking often of Daniel and her plans to catch his interest. She asked Eliza's opinion on what ribbons suited her hair best, or which dress looked most flattering, though she rarely waited for Eliza's answer before deciding for herself. Eliza tried to be dutiful, stitching hems and mending lace, but she could not keep her mind from replaying her brief exchange with Daniel by the water trough. "Seems to me they're missing out." Those words haunted her, lit a small flame of hope inside her chest. Yet she dared not speak of it, not to her sister, not even to herself aloud. To imagine that Daniel Hayes might look at her with any true interest felt like blasphemy against the natural order of things. Still, her heart betrayed her whenever she saw him in town. At the general store, when Daniel helped her lift a sack of flour into the wagon, she felt the warmth of his hand brush hers. At the blacksmith's, when she waited for a tool to be mended, she caught his eyes on her, a thoughtful look he quickly masked. Each tiny encounter left her shaken, torn between longing and guilt, for Clara had noticed too. She wasn't blind. The way Daniel's gaze sometimes lingered on Eliza, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable, was enough to stir a fierce spark of jealousy. Clara had always been the one men chose. The thought that her quieter, plainer sister might draw a man's admiration was intolerable. Whispers began to reach Clara's ears as well. One evening after church, she overheard Mrs. Patterson remark to another matron, "Strange, isn't it? I could swear that cowboy looks more at Eliza than Clara." The women chuckled, dismissing it as fancy, but Clara's jaw tightened. That night, as she brushed her hair before bed, Clara glanced at her sister across the room. Eliza was bent over her sewing, her face calm, lost in the rhythm of needle and thread. To anyone else, she looked plain and harmless. But Clara knew better. Competition had never existed between them before. Clara had always won without effort, and Eliza had accepted her place in the shadows. But now, for the first time, Clara felt the stirrings of something dangerous in her heart. Fear. Fear that Daniel Hayes might be different. Fear that he might see beyond the surface, into the quiet strength her sister carried. Fear that for once, Clara might not be the one chosen, and that fear would not sit quietly. It would grow, pressing between the sisters like a wedge neither of them could remove. Daniel Hayes was a man accustomed to hard work and long trails, not idle talk or aimless company. Yet in the weeks that followed the barn dance, folks in Willow Creek began to notice he lingered in town more often than a drifter usually did. Some said he was looking to buy land, others whispered he might be scouting for cattle. The truth was simpler, though Daniel told no one. He found himself looking for reasons to cross paths with Eliza Dawson. It began with small gestures. At the general store, he appeared beside her as she struggled to lift a heavy sack of flour into her wagon. Without a word, he swung it up with ease, tipping his hat when she murmured thanks. Another time, he carried a bucket for her from the well, his steady pace slowing to match hers, though she insisted she could manage. To outsiders, it was nothing, a man lending a hand. But to Eliza, each kindness felt weighted, deliberate, as though Daniel was seeing her, not merely performing a courtesy. She tried to brush it aside. Eliza was too practical to indulge in fantasies, and she reminded herself often that Daniel could not possibly mean anything by it. Men helped women, especially when Clara wasn't around to command their attention. Still, her heart betrayed her each time his gray eyes found hers, each time his voice dropped into that low, steady tone that seemed meant only for her ears. Clara, of course, noticed. She always noticed. When Daniel lifted the flour sack for Eliza, Clara's smile stiffened. When he paused to speak with Eliza outside the church one Sunday, Clara swept in with a laugh, slipping her arm through his as though to remind him where his attention should lie. Daniel was polite, never rude, but Clara could not ignore the fact that he allowed the moments with Eliza to stretch longer than courtesy required. That tension seeped into the Dawson household. Clara grew sharper in her remarks, teasing Eliza about her plain dresses or her calloused hands, all while keeping her tone sweet enough that others would not mark the cruelty. Eliza bore it silently, as she always had, but inside her heart was a whirl of guilt and confusion. She had never competed with Clara for anything, least of all a man's affection, and the thought that Daniel might prefer her was both thrilling and terrifying. Daniel himself wrestled with his own thoughts. Clara was lovely, no doubt, and any man in Willow Creek would have been proud to court her. But beauty alone had never moved him. He had seen enough of the world to know that prettiness faded quickly when hardship came. What struck him about Eliza was not her looks, though he found her quietly handsome in her own way. It was her strength. He noticed how she always carried more than her share, how her hands worked without complaint, how her eyes held a depth of patience and kindness that could not be feigned. One afternoon, when he found her kneeling in the dirt of her mother's garden, sleeves rolled to the elbow and hair escaping its braid, he caught himself pausing just to watch her. She glanced up startled, and he offered a small smile. "You keep things growing better than most men I know," he said. Her face flushed, and she ducked her head. "It's just beans, Mr. Hayes, nothing remarkable." But Daniel shook his head, his gaze steady. "It's more remarkable than you think." It was a simple moment, easily forgotten by anyone else, but for Eliza it lodged deep inside her heart. For the first time, someone had looked past her plainness, her chores, her second-hand dresses, and seen something worth admiring, And Clara, watching from the porch with narrowed eyes, felt her fear sharpen into anger. The uneasy peace in the Dawson household could not last. Clara's jealousy, once a quiet ember, had grown into a flame she could no longer hide. Day by day, she watched Daniel's subtle attentions drift away from her and toward Eliza. An offered hand here, a thoughtful word there. Each moment left Clara more determined to reassert her place, even if it meant tearing her sister down. The breaking point came one evening after a church supper. The townsfolk had lingered in the yard, enjoying the late summer air while children played tag between the wagons. Daniel had stayed behind to help the older women carry tables back inside, earning nods of approval from the men. Clara, seeing her chance, gathered a cluster of girls near the well where Eliza stood rinsing dishes. With her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, Clara said, "It's a mercy Mama has Eliza to tend to her. We all know she'll never have a family of her own." She laughed lightly, twirling a curl around her finger. Why, no man in his right mind would look twice when her sister is standing in the room. The girls tittered, more from discomfort than amusement, but Clara pressed on, her smile gleaming like polished steel. "It's for the best, really. Some women are made to be wives, others are made to scrub floors." Eliza froze, dish in hand, the cool water running over her fingers as the words sank in. She had endured Clara's barbs before, but never so openly, never with the whole town as witness. Heat rushed to her cheeks, though she kept her head down, praying no one could see how deeply the insult cut. But someone did see. Daniel Hayes had stepped out of the church just in time to catch Clara's words. He stopped in the shadows, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Clara, radiant and cruel. Eliza, silent and small, bearing the humiliation with quiet dignity. Something shifted inside him then. He had suspected Clara's beauty was only skin deep, but now he saw it plain. And Eliza, though she said nothing, though her hurt showed only in the stiffness of her shoulders, revealed more strength in that moment than Clara ever had in her polished charm. Daniel strode forward, his boots striking the packed earth with purpose. The laughter died instantly as the girls noticed him approach. Clara's smile faltered, though she quickly pasted on another brighter one. "Mr. Hayes, we were just talking too loud," Daniel cut in, his voice calm but edged with steel. His gaze flicked to Eliza, softening. "Miss Dawson, can I help you with those dishes?" Eliza blinked in surprise, her hands trembling slightly as she passed him a bowl. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. The girls exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. Clara's face burned, though she forced another laugh. "Why, Mr. Hayes, you'll spoil her. Eliza's quite used to—" Daniel set the bowl down firmly, his gray eyes locking onto Clara's. "I reckon Eliza's used to carrying more than her share. Doesn't mean she ought to." The weight of his words hung in the air. Clara, for the first time in memory, had no reply. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the balance of admiration tipping away from her and toward the sister she had always dismissed. Eliza lowered her eyes, torn between shame and a flicker of gratitude. She had never asked for Daniel's defense, yet his words had carved through the cruelty like a blade. For the first time, she felt the possibility that someone might stand beside her, not out of pity, but out of respect. That night, long after the townsfolk had gone home, Clara sat before her mirror, staring at her reflection with narrowed eyes. For years, she had been the brightest star in Willow Creek, unchallenged, unquestioned. But now, because of Daniel Hayes, her light was dimming, and Eliza, the sister left behind, was beginning to shine, and Clara vowed she would not allow it. The storm came suddenly, as they often did on the prairie. By late afternoon, the sky had turned an ominous shade of green-gray, the wind rising sharp enough to rattle shutters and send dust spiraling down Willow Creek's main street. The Dawson homestead sat exposed on the edge of town, its weathered boards groaning as the air thickened with the smell of rain and electricity. Eliza had been outside tending to the chickens when she felt the shift in the wind. The birds squawked restlessly, sensing the danger before the first roll of thunder cracked across the plains. She hurried to gather them into the coop, her braid whipping loose in the gusts. From the porch, Clara called out in alarm, clutching her skirts as though the storm itself were a personal affront. "Eliza! Leave them! You'll be blown clear away!" Clara shouted, her voice shrill over the rising wind. But Eliza shook her head, her hands steady even as the gale fought her every movement. "They'll die if I don't," she called back, forcing the last stubborn hen inside before bolting the coop. By the time she reached the porch, the sky had split wide, unleashing sheets of rain. The roof of the old barn groaned under the weight of the storm, water pouring in through gaps. Inside, the family's small milk cow bellowed in panic. Their mother, frail and coughing, clung to the doorway, eyes wide with fear. Eliza didn't hesitate. "Clara, keep Mama inside by the fire." "I'll see to the cow." Clara's eyes flashed. "You can't go out there again." "It's madness." But Eliza was already pulling her shawl tighter, pushing against the wind toward the barn. The rain stung her face like needles, the mud sucking at her boots, but she pressed forward. The barn door banged wildly on its hinges as she fought it open, stumbling inside to find the animal thrashing in fear. And then, through the roar of thunder and the howl of wind, another set of hands appeared beside hers. Strong hands steadying the door, holding it firm. She turned and found Daniel Hayes, rain streaming from his hat, his face set with determination. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice firm but not scolding. Eliza's breath caught, both in surprise and relief. "The roof won't hold," she said quickly. "If it caves, the cow will brace it." Without another word, Daniel seized a beam of timber lying nearby, hauling it into place to prop up the sagging rafters. Eliza joined him, her smaller frame straining against the weight but refusing to yield. Together, side by side, they forced the beam upright until the structure steadied with a groan. For long minutes they worked in silence, shouting instructions over the storm. Eliza fetched rope to lash the supports. Daniel calmed the cow with a firm hand and low words. Their movements fell into rhythm. Two people bound by necessity, by grit, by the unspoken understanding that survival on the frontier demanded more than beauty or charm. By the time the worst of the storm passed, both were soaked to the bone, hair plastered to their faces, arms trembling from exertion. Yet the barn still stood, the cow safe within. Eliza leaned against the wall, breathless, while Daniel straightened, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You're stronger than most men I've known," he said at last, his tone carrying both admiration and something deeper. Eliza's cheeks burned, though not from the cold. She opened her mouth to reply but found no words. For once, silence was enough. Back at the house, Clara watched from the window, her face pale, not with fear of the storm but with something far sharper. She had hidden inside, wringing her hands and weeping into their mother's shoulder, while Eliza had faced the tempest head-on. And Daniel, the man Clara had determined to claim, had chosen to fight that battle beside her sister. When the rain eased and the sun broke weakly through the clouds, the choice had already been made. Daniel Hayes would never look at Clara the same way again. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered. The prairie lay drenched and glistening, the earth soaked, the air sharp with the scent of wet grass and wood. At the Dawson homestead, the barn still bore scars of the night, broken shingles, leaning timbers, but it stood, thanks to Eliza and Daniel. News of their efforts spread fast. In Willow Creek, nothing stayed secret for long. By the next morning, tongues wagged in the mercantile, the churchyard, and the saloon. Folks whispered how Miss Eliza Dawson had braved the storm, how Daniel Hayes had stood shoulder to shoulder with her, how Clara, beautiful, admired Clara, had not been seen outside until the skies cleared. Clara heard every word, each one cutting deeper than the last. She held her head high, forcing smiles, pretending the talk did not wound her. But inside she was unraveling. For years, admiration had been her birthright, and now she felt it slipping through her fingers. Stolen by the sister she had always dismissed, Eliza, meanwhile, kept to her chores, though her heart beat differently now. Daniel's words in the barn, "You're stronger than most men I've known," echoed through her, warming her even as they unsettled her. She dared not think too much of them. Men praised women when circumstances called for it, but admiration didn't always last. And she, plain and practical, was not the sort of woman men chose, or so she believed. The following Sunday, the little church of Willow Creek was filled to bursting. Families filed into the pews in their best clothes, the storm already a tale folks told with wide eyes and grateful sighs. Clara was radiant in pale blue, her hair shining like spun gold, her smile as bright as ever. She expected, no, demanded, that Daniel's eyes would find her. But when he entered, freshly shaven, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his gaze swept the room and settled squarely on Eliza. Whispers started instantly. Some leaned forward eagerly, others hid their smirks. Clara stiffened, her hands tightening around her prayer book. The service passed in a blur, and afterward the congregation gathered in the yard, exchanging pleasantries beneath the warming sun. It was then Daniel stepped forward, clearing his throat, his hat in his hands. "I've got something to say," he announced, his deep voice carrying easily over the chatter. Silence fell. Children stopped their games, women clutched their shawls, and the men straightened, curious. Clara's heart leapt, certain this was the moment he would declare himself hers before the whole town. She tilted her chin, her smile already in place, but Daniel turned, not to Clara, but to Eliza. His gray eyes held steady as he spoke. "Miss Dawson, I reckon I've never met a woman with your courage. Last night showed me something I can't ignore. That strength of heart means more than beauty or finery. You've stood tall when others would have faltered, and I'd be honored if you'd let me stand by your side from this day forward." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara's smile shattered, her face blanching as though struck. Eliza froze, her world spinning. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice barely audible. She could hardly comprehend what was happening. No one had ever chosen her over Clara. No man had ever spoken her name with such respect, such certainty. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice, though all still strained to hear. "Eliza, I'm asking for your hand. Not out of pity, not out of duty, but because I see you. Truly see you." Tears welled in her eyes. Her heart, so long trained to endure silence and shadows, ached with the weight of his words. She looked around. The shocked faces, Clara trembling with fury, her mother watching with trembling hands clasped, and then back at Daniel, whose eyes held nothing but truth. Her lips parted. "Yes," she whispered. The yard erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some delighted. Clara fled inside, unable to bear the sight. But Daniel didn't waver. He took Eliza's hand firmly in his, lifting it as though to anchor his vow. In that moment, before God and their neighbors, Eliza Dawson, the sister left behind, was chosen. The days following Daniel's proposal were unlike anything Eliza had ever known. For so long, she had lived in the quiet corners of her family's life, unnoticed, uncelebrated, her worth measured only by her ability to scrub, mend, and sacrifice. Now, with Daniel's hand clasped in hers, she found herself stepping into the light, tentatively at first, as though afraid it might vanish, but more confidently with each passing day. Willow Creek buzzed with talk. Some admired Daniel's choice, praising him for valuing strength and character over beauty. Others whispered that he had been bewitched, that Clara had been robbed of the future she was destined for. Eliza heard it all, the kind words and the cruel alike, but Daniel's steady presence grounded her. When the doubts pricked, his calm gray eyes reminded her she was no longer invisible. Clara, meanwhile, struggled with her new reality. Her pride, once as untouchable as her beauty, had been battered before the entire town. Though she still held herself with elegance, her laughter rang hollow, her smile stretched thin. She avoided Daniel and Eliza, unable to mask the storm inside her. For the first time in her life, she was not the center of attention, and she did not know who she was without it. Despite the tension, Eliza remained gentle with her sister. One evening, as they folded laundry together, she reached for Clara's hand. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But I can't apologize for Daniel's choice. He saw me, and I've waited my whole life to be seen." Clara pulled her hand away, her blue eyes flashing with pain. You waited? You think I haven't? I've fought just as hard for admiration, for love. And now, when it finally mattered, you took the one thing I wanted most. Eliza's throat tightened, but she said nothing more. She understood then that Clara's wounds ran deeper than jealousy. They were carved from fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of being ordinary. For Eliza, strength had been survival. For Clara, beauty had been her armor. Without it, she felt defenseless. The wedding came swiftly, as frontier weddings often did. The church was decorated with wildflowers gathered from the prairie, their bright colors a symbol of new beginnings. Eliza wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, nothing extravagant, but Daniel looked at her as though she were the only woman in the world. When they exchanged vows, his voice steady and hers trembling but sure, the congregation bore witness to more than a union of two people. They saw a quiet truth laid bare, that worth was not measured in finery or charm, but in resilience, loyalty, and courage. Afterward, as the small celebration spilled out into the churchyard, Eliza's mother pulled her close, tears glistening in her eyes. "Child," she whispered, her voice frail but fierce, "for years I feared you'd be left behind. But I see now, you were only waiting for the man who could match your heart." Eliza held her mother tightly, her chest swelling with a gratitude too large for words. Daniel led her to their wagon, ready to take her to the small homestead he had been preparing. As she looked back one last time, she caught sight of Clara standing alone beneath the oak tree, her hands clasped tightly, her face unreadable. Eliza's heart ached, but she knew this was a path she could not walk for her sister. Clara would have to find her own way, her own truth. The wagon jolted forward, the sun dipping low across the wide prairie. Daniel reached for Eliza's hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You've got a long road ahead, Mrs. Hayes," he said with a smile. She smiled back, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "Then let's walk it together." And so the girl left behind, the sister overlooked, underestimated and unchosen, rode into her new life not as a shadow, but as a woman finally seen, finally cherished, and finally free to begin again. It was truly a new beginning.